Thank you very much. It's so nice to be here, and thanks to Professor D'Amico. It's funny for me to play with Professor D'Amico. I went to school with Professor D'Amico, so he ain't here next. You probably know it already, actually. But it's really a pleasure to be here to talk to you. I'm going to be talking about my broad research area is on economic development. And within that, a lot of my research is focused on several related areas. The first is weak and failed states. And the related part is the efforts by the United States, but also other developed countries, the international development community, if you want to think about it that way, to bring liberalism. When I say liberalism, I mean democracy, markets, and so on to these countries. And so what I'm going to be talking about today is the application of the tools of economics to the application of tools of economics to efforts to basically reconstruct countries. And by the way, although I'm focusing on post-conflict reconstruction, the countries that have gone through some form of conflict, we can apply the same logic to things like what's going on in Haiti now. So we can talk about post-disaster recovery. And of course, many of you experienced this firsthand several years ago here in New Orleans. So a lot of the things I'm going to talk about apply to that as well. And during the Q&A, we can talk about that. So what exactly am I talking about with post-conflict reconstruction? Well, in the broadest sense, we can understand it as basically building and rebuilding physical infrastructure, rejuvenating human capital, so investing in human capital, restarting or beginning the provision of basic services for basic necessities that citizens need, as well as fundamental changes to economic institutions, legal institutions, and political institutions. So we're basically trying to redesign these societies. So the purpose of my research basically is to contribute to the large variance. There have been some successes. There are far and few between. Going back to when we went to Iraq and Afghanistan, what did you hear the presidents and a lot of other people talking about? Post-World War II, Japan and Germany. And these are still held up as the kind of benchmarks of the gold standards of the United States' ability to go into other countries and basically rebuild them the way we want and leave them better off than they were. But as I talk about in my book, there's a lot more failures than successes, and I think economics provides insight into why we should expect that trend to continue. So what's missing? Well, what's missing from all these discussions is economics. For the most part, all these discussions are undertaken by politicians, pundits, political scientists, those in public policy, historians, and of course they all have important things to say. But we know that economics is applicable across time and space. We know that people respond to incentives and that people face constraints. And it's no different in efforts to export democracy. In fact, when I got into this topic, it happened during graduate school. I actually wrote my dissertation on it. And it was when we first went to Iraq, I remember all these Democrats were saying, well, the Republicans aren't planning well. And the Republicans were saying, well, the Democrats are soft on terror and they don't want to protect America. And there was all this infighting between the State Department and the Pentagon. And everyone's like, say it's the Republicans. And they said, no, it's the Democrats. And then it got me to thinking, well, no, really, it's just people responding to incentives. And if you look historically back at past efforts as well, even in Germany and Japan after World War II, we saw a lot of the same behavior. And basically what happens is all the people involved, I call them the reconstruction authorities, but when I use that catch-all, basically what I'm talking about is all the different politicians, the practitioners, the people giving aid, all the development experts, I put that in quotes, who think they know how to rebuild the country and what they need to get wealthy. Really, they were just responding to incentives. And in many cases, they face very perverse incentives, which lead to perverse outcomes. So if you have even the most basic understanding of economics, a lot of this stuff shouldn't come as a surprise. Now, what I want to put forth is that, and this is scary, most of the people involved in these things have no idea about basic economics. And here's a perfect example. I came across this the other day. It's a 1960 article in the New York Times. All right? Mistakes Beset Afghan project. Basically, the Helmand River Valley, which is in the southern part of Afghanistan, the U.S. invested, it was a joint partnership, over $100 million in 1960 dollars in a project to basically bring economic prosperity to Afghanistan. They were going to resettle people, move them around the country, resettle them into what were called model villages, rebuild all this infrastructure, irrigation. They sent all these tractors over there. And this article talks about, this is from 1960, they refer to it as a comedy of errors. They talk about these tractors that have been sent over sitting there and rusting, no one's using them. These infrastructure projects are basically half completed, they're not working correctly, there's all this waste going on. And this is the key line for those of us interested in economics. A major fault in the planning of the project was that the human element was overlooked. All right, now, a very obvious thing, if I said to you, look, if we're going to invest $100 million to fix something, wouldn't you want to at least try to anticipate or think about how people are going to respond to what you're doing? Well, apparently not. Now, what I want to suggest is that things haven't changed that much in the past 50 years. In fact, if you've been following the news, the U.S. right now, it's a U.S.-led military initiative, is taking place where? In the Helmand River Valley, right? It's a Taliban stronghold. So we have very good evidence, by the way, that this project failed miserably because it's very poor and it's a stronghold of the Taliban. And now we're involved there, not so much in economic reconstruction, but just trying to gain control over it, basic security. So it's all about incentives and constraints. And if you understand this, it gets you a long way in understanding why these efforts tend to fail, but also why development, why externally driven development efforts in general tend to fail. And pretty much everyone cares about making people better off. You just ask the average person, whether an economist or not, do you prefer people in Africa or poor people to be better off? They'll say, yeah, of course. But they tend to propose these grandiose visions and plans for making these countries better off, which tend to make them worse off. And it all goes back to this lack of basic understanding of principles of microeconomics. So here's how I'd like to proceed. I've broken this down just for kind of to categorize it neatly into 4 traps. I call them traps. And the reason I call them traps is the following. For those of you who have ever taken an economic development course, or if you haven't, there's lots of traps we talk about. There's poverty traps, there's conflict traps, there's geography traps, there's population traps. And they say, see, all these poor countries, they're stuck in these traps. So we need the wealthy countries to design a plan to break them out of the trap. The poverty trap, right? It says, look, poor people are too poor to save. And if you can't save, if you're consuming at a subsistence level, you can't save, which means you can't make subsequent capital investments, which means you'll never develop. So what do we need to do to break out of this trap? Dump lots of money on them, right? They say population trap. There's too many people. They're trapped because of population. How do they do it? Well, they either want to basically inject large amounts of contraceptives or they want to design some kind of family planning. You only can have X amount of children. Geography trap. Well, we can move people here, we can move people there. Sounds kind of like what they're trying to do here, right? If we can just pick up these people, relocate them here or there, so on, we'll be good to go. But what does this assume? It assumes that a bunch of experts sitting in a room, typically in Washington, D.C., can design a plan to make other groups of people better off. In other words, it assumes you can design an optimal policy and implement it the way you want with the intended consequences. But here's the thing. Lots of times when we do this, policymakers get stuck in traps. In other words, there's meta traps that oftentimes preclude the ability of policymakers, practitioners, reconstruction authorities, to basically accomplish the ends that they want to. And I'm going to talk about 4 of those traps today. This is not necessarily an exhaustive list. The first is called the credible commitment trap. Now, you may have heard about this problem of credible commitment in some of your economics classes. It actually came out of Milton Friedman's work originally on monetary policy, and then Finn Pidlin and Edward Prescott's work on government policy in general. And they won the Nobel Prize for that. They were awarded the Nobel Prize in 2004. The idea behind the problem of credible commitment is as follows. You make a policy today, you're a policymaker, and you say, we are going to do X. Without a binding constraint on your behavior that actually force you to do X, you may very well have an incentive to renege on that policy in future periods. So why did Milton Friedman talk about this with monetary policy? Well, the monetary authorities say, we're going to grow the money supply by X amount and we will not go beyond that, really, I promise. Right? And then there's no binding constraint on them, and stuff changes next month, and all of a sudden they're changing the money supply. Now, you might be able to get away with this once, maybe twice, but people are smart. And citizens start to say, wait, you keep telling us you're going to do X, but then you keep lying. So why am I going to believe you anymore? And of course, there is no good reason to believe them. So the credible commitment trap is that without a binding constraint on your behavior, you have an incentive to change it. And citizens know that, so they won't buy in. Now, the credible commitment trap with Reconstruction is slightly different. Because we're not necessarily talking about monetary policy. That might be part of it. We're talking about basically passing basic policies to, for instance, protect property rights. Right? We go into a war-torn country and we say, we're establishing property rights. The government promises not to dash you over